A man doesn't always know the moment he ruins his own life. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary choice on an ordinary afternoon. Caleb Turner said that once, though there was no one left in the house to hear him say it again. The cabin sat quiet at the edge of his land, 20 miles outside of Red Hollow, where the wind moved slow through the fence posts and the dust settled in places no one bothered to sweep anymore. There was a table by the window, solid oak, worn smooth by years of use, and on it sat 2 plates. Only one had ever been touched. The other stayed clean, waiting in a way that felt heavier than anything Caleb had ever carried. He stood there most evenings with a tin cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at that empty place like it might answer something if he gave it enough time. Outside, the sun dropped low, turning the fields gold and then gray, and the horses shifted in the pasture, restless for no reason he could name. It hadn't always been like this. There had been a day, not long ago, when the world still felt open, like something could be built if a man chose right. That day had started at the depot in town, where the train came in once a week and left behind more dust than people. Caleb remembered the heat most of all, the kind that pressed against your skin and made every breath feel heavier than the last. Folks had gathered early, boots on wood, voices low, all waiting for the same thing. 10 women stepped down from that train, each one carrying everything she owned in a single bag, each one looking for a place to belong. He hadn't planned on being there. Not really. But a man alone too long starts to hear the silence louder than anything else, and sometimes that's enough to make him do something he doesn't fully understand. He had stood at the edge of the crowd, hat low, watching as names were called and choices were made. One by one, the women were taken, their faces changing from worry to relief in the span of a heartbeat. It was a strange thing to watch, how quickly a life could shift just because someone decided to see you. Caleb had told himself he was only there to look, to make a practical decision, nothing more. That's what a man did when he had land to run and no one to help him run it. He told himself it wasn't about anything else. Then there had been a moment, quiet and easy to miss, when his eyes had moved past the ones everyone else was watching and settled somewhere further down the line. He couldn't say now exactly what had caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she stood, not small, but not trying to be seen either. Maybe it was her hands, rough and steady, the kind that knew work without needing to talk about it. Or maybe it was just the way she didn't look away when people looked through her, like she had already learned how to live without being chosen. Her name, he would remember later, was Eliza Hart. But that day, she was just another face in a line that was getting shorter by the minute. And Caleb, standing there with the weight of his own quiet pressing in on him, did what most men would have called the sensible thing. He looked once. Then he looked away. Caleb did not step forward right away. He let the others move first, boots thudding against the wooden platform, voices rising and falling like it was a market instead of something that would shape the rest of a person's life. A man to his left laughed low, already sure of his choice, and reached for a woman with bright ribbons in her hair. Another tipped his hat and spoke in a tone that sounded practiced, like he had said the same words before. One by one, the line shifted, the space between the women growing wider, the air thinning with each decision made. Caleb stayed where he was, hands resting at his sides, watching the way relief came quick to some faces and never came at all to others. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, for the one that made the most sense, the one that would fit into the life he had already built out on that stretch of land where the wind did most of the talking. Practical, that was the word he kept turning over in his mind. He needed someone who could manage a house, keep things steady, understand the work without asking too many questions. That was all this was supposed to be, nothing more. The woman he eventually stepped toward stood near the center of what remained, her dress clean, her posture careful, her smile ready before he even spoke. She looked at him the way people do when they expect to be chosen, not with arrogance, but with a kind of quiet certainty. He recognized that look. It made things easier. He said her name when it was offered, nodded once, and that was enough. Papers would be signed later, arrangements made, the rest of it falling into place the way these things always did. Around them, the crowd shifted again, attention moving on, already searching for the next moment worth watching. It should have felt settled then, like a job done and done well. But something in the back of his mind did not sit right, not loud, not enough to stop him, just a small thing that lingered the way a loose board does under your boot. He turned, just once, not even meaning to, and his eyes found the far end of the platform again. There were only 2 women left now. One of them was speaking quickly to the agent, her voice tight, her hands moving as if she could bargain her way into being seen. The other stood still. Eliza Hart. She had not moved closer when the line shortened, had not stepped forward when there was room. She stood where she had been from the start, like she understood something the others did not. The wind caught the edge of her dress, lifting it just enough to show dust along the hem, miles of it, like she had carried the road with her. Her hands were folded in front of her, not hiding, just resting, and there was a steadiness in them that did not belong to someone waiting to be saved. Caleb felt it again then, that small pull, the kind that does not ask for attention but holds it anyway. For a second, it seemed like she might look at him, like something might pass between them that had nothing to do with the choices being made around them. But she did not. She kept her eyes level, not on him, not on anyone, just forward, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. Caleb shifted his weight, the boards, creaking under his boots, and the moment slipped past, as easy as breath. He turned back to the woman beside him, to the voices, to the business of it all, and by the time he looked again, the platform had begun to empty, and Eliza Hart was no longer there. The wagon ride out of town took longer than it should have, not because of the distance, but because of the silence that settled between them early and never quite lifted. Caleb held the reins steady, the leather worn smooth under his hands, the mule team moving at an even pace along the dry road that stretched west toward his land. Beside him, the woman he had chosen sat upright, careful in the way she held herself, her gloved hands folded in her lap, as if she had practiced this moment before stepping onto that train. She spoke once or twice at the beginning, small things about the weather, about the journey, about how far it might be, and Caleb answered in short replies that did not invite more. It was not unkind, just the way he had learned to live, keeping words to what was needed and nothing beyond. By the time the town had faded behind them, her voice had gone quiet, and the only sounds left were the creak of the wagon, the slow rhythm of hooves against packed dirt, and the wind moving through the open land like it had all the time in the world. He told himself this was how it was supposed to feel. Simple, practical, 2 people with a shared understanding of what needed to be done. When they reached the ranch near sundown, the sky stretched wide and pale, the last light catching on the fence line and the low roof of the cabin that had stood there longer than most men stayed anywhere. Caleb stepped down first, tying off the team before turning back to offer a hand. She hesitated just a second before taking it, her grip light, careful not to press too hard, as if she did not want to leave a mark on anything that belonged to him. Inside, the cabin held the same quiet it always had, a table set near the window, a stove cold until someone bothered to bring it to life, shelves lined with what a man needed and nothing he did not. She looked around slowly, taking it in, her eyes moving over each corner like she was measuring it against something only she could see. It was clean enough, ordered in a way that made sense to him, but there was no warmth in it yet, nothing that suggested a second person had ever belonged there. He set her bag by the wall and spoke in that same even tone, telling her where things were, what needed doing, how the days usually ran. She nodded at the right moments, listening closely, not interrupting, her attention steady in a way that should have felt like understanding but did not quite reach that far. Supper that night was simple, beans and bread, coffee poured into 2 tin cups that steamed briefly before cooling in the open air of the room. They sat across from each other, the table between them holding more space than it should have, and ate without much talk. Caleb noticed small things without meaning to. The way she waited for him to start before lifting her fork. The way her movements stayed careful, contained, like she was following a set of rules he had never spoken out loud. It was all right. That was what he told himself. All right was enough. But as the light faded and the shadows settled into the corners of the room, there was a moment when he reached for his cup and paused, just for a second, because something about the quiet did not feel the same as it had before. It was not heavier, not lighter, just different in a way he could not name. And somewhere in that difference, unspoken and easy to ignore, was the faint memory of a pair of steady hands he had seen only once and not long enough to understand. The next morning came in quiet, the kind that settled over the land before the sun had fully decided to rise. Caleb woke the way he always did, before first light, his body already used to the rhythm of work that did not wait for anyone. For a moment, lying there, he forgot there was someone else in the house. It had been years since that thought had been true, and habit did not change overnight. Then he heard it, a faint sound from the other room, not loud enough to startle, just present enough to remind him that something had shifted. He sat up, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the main room expecting the same stillness he had known for so long. Instead, there was fire in the stove. Not roaring, not out of control, just steady, the kind of fire that had been built with care and patience. The air held a different weight to it, warmer, carrying the faint smell of coffee that had been set on early and left to settle into itself. She stood by the table, her back to him, sleeves rolled just enough to keep them out of the way, her hands moving in small, practiced motions that did not waste time. He watched for a second before saying anything, noticing how natural it looked, like she had always been there, like the house had simply been waiting for someone to move through it that way. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. She turned, offering a small nod, not quite a smile, but not distant either. "Morning. Coffee is ready." He stepped closer, reaching for the cup she had already set aside, and paused again, just briefly, because she had poured it the way he liked without being told. Strong, dark, no extra water to stretch it thin. He did not ask how she knew. Some things a person noticed without needing an explanation. They ate in the same quiet as the night before, but it did not feel as empty now. She did not fill the silence with talk, and he did not expect her to. There was a kind of understanding in it, or at least the beginning of one, built out of small things instead of words. When he stood to leave, she was already moving, clearing the plates, setting things in order without being asked. He hesitated at the door, something unfamiliar catching at him, the sense that he should say something more, something that marked the change, but the words did not come, and after a second, he stepped outside into the cold morning air and let the work take over. The hours passed the way they always did, fence lines to check, water to haul, animals to tend, the sun climbing slow and steady until it hung overhead and pressed down on everything in sight. By the time he returned near midday, dust clung to his clothes, and his hands carried the roughness of the land in them. He pushed the door open expecting to find her inside, but the room was empty. The fire had been banked properly, the table wiped clean, everything in its place with a care that had not been there before. For a moment, he stood still, listening, the quiet settling around him again, different now than it had been before she arrived. Then he heard it, faint but steady, coming from outside near the far fence. He stepped back into the sunlight and followed the sound, boots pressing into the dry ground, until he saw her. She stood near a section of broken rail he had meant to fix for months, her hands working at it with a focus that did not leave room for hesitation. The wood had been reset, the pieces aligned in a way that would hold, not perfect, but solid enough to last through the season. She did not notice him at first, too absorbed in the task, and he found himself watching again, the same way he had at the depot, noticing the steadiness in her hands, the quiet confidence in the way she moved. It was not showy work, not meant to impress, just done because it needed doing. He stepped closer then, the sound of his boots finally drawing her attention. She straightened, brushing dust from her palms, meeting his gaze without lowering her eyes. "Thought it needed fixing," she said simply. Caleb looked at the fence, then back at her, something shifting again in a way he could not quite place. It had needed fixing for a long time. He just had not done it. And now, without a word, she had. Caleb stood there a moment longer than necessary, his eyes moving over the repaired section of fence, then back to her hands, then away again, as if he did not want to look too closely at something he had not expected to find. He gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge the work. "It will hold," he said. She nodded once, brushing the last of the dust from her skirt, her breathing steady like she had not just spent the better part of an hour doing something he himself had put off for months. They walked back toward the house together, not side by side exactly, but close enough that the silence between them felt shared instead of separate. The afternoon settled into its usual rhythm, but there was a shift in it now, something subtle that did not announce itself but stayed present all the same. Caleb found himself noticing more than he meant to. The way tools he had left scattered were gathered and set where they could be found again. The way the water bucket stayed filled without him remembering when it had been done. The way the door no longer creaked quite as loudly because someone had taken the time to work oil into the hinges. None of it was large enough to speak on. None of it demanded attention. But it built, piece by piece, into something that made the place feel less like a stop along the way and more like something that could be stayed in. That evening, when the light turned soft and the sky stretched out in that wide Texas gold, he came in from the last of his work and found the table already set. 2 plates again, steam rising from the food in a quiet, steady way. She stood by the stove, not waiting exactly, but not moving on either, as if she understood that some things were meant to be done together even when nothing was said about it. He washed his hands at the basin, the water cool against his skin, and sat down across from her. They ate in the same silence as before, but it had changed its shape. It no longer pressed in. It held. He noticed then that she did not rush through her meal, did not look toward him for cues, did not try to fill the space with anything that was not already there. She simply ate, steady and present, like she belonged to the moment in a way that did not need permission. After they finished, she cleared the table without asking, her movements as natural as breathing, and he found himself lingering, his hands resting on the wood where the plates had been, his eyes tracing the grain like he was looking for something written there. Later, as the night settled in and the air cooled, he stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, the kind that had been left just long enough to lose its heat, but not its strength. The land stretched out in front of him, quiet and endless, the same as it had always been. But when he turned back toward the house, there was a light in the window that had not been there before, steady and warm against the dark. He stood there longer than he should have, watching it, feeling something settle in his chest that he could not quite name. It was not joy, not yet, but it was not emptiness either. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, without warning and without reason, a memory surfaced again. A pair of hands at the far end of a platform. Still, certain, unclaimed. He took a slow breath, the night air cool in his lungs, and let it go. Whatever that had been, it was behind him now. Or at least, that is what he told himself as he stepped back inside and closed the door. The days began to settle into a pattern that did not need to be spoken aloud. Morning came with fire already lit and coffee waiting on the stove, the kind that held its strength even after sitting a while. Caleb found himself waking not just to the habit of work, but to the quiet presence of something already in motion before he stepped into it. She moved through the house with a kind of certainty that did not ask for attention, her hands finding what needed doing without hesitation, as if she had been there longer than she had. He did not question it. Some things were easier to accept without pulling them apart. Out on the land, the work stayed the same: fences, water, animals, the slow turning of days that did not change for anyone. But when he came back now, there were small signs that something was being built without him noticing when it started. A loose board near the porch had been set straight. The latch on the gate no longer stuck when he pushed it closed. Even the path between the well and the house had been cleared of the stones that used to catch at his boots when he was too tired to pay attention. None of it was asked for. None of it was explained. It was just done. That afternoon, the sky turned overcast in a way that promised weather later, the kind that rolled in slow and stayed longer than expected. Caleb had been working the far side of the property when he noticed the change, the air growing heavier, the light thinning out before its time. By the time he made his way back, the first drops had already started, light at first, then steady, tapping against the roof in a rhythm that filled the space between sounds. He stepped inside, shaking the damp from his coat, and found her by the table, not working, not moving, just standing there with something in her hands. A piece of paper, folded once, edges worn like it had been carried longer than it should have been. She did not hide it when he came in. She simply held it, her fingers resting against it in that same steady way he had seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence, soft against the walls, the fire low but holding. "You got caught in it," she said finally, her voice even. Caleb nodded, setting his hat by the door. "It will pass." She looked toward the window, where the land blurred slightly under the falling rain, then back down at the paper in her hands. "Some things do," she said. He did not ask what she meant. It did not seem like the kind of thing meant for questions. Instead, he moved to the stove, pouring what was left of the coffee into his cup, the warmth grounding him in a way the words did not. They stood there a while like that, the space between them filled with things unsaid but not uncomfortable. After a moment, she set the paper down on the table, not pushing it away, just placing it there like it belonged. The edge of it caught his attention, the handwriting visible where the fold did not fully hide it. Neat. Careful. Not the kind of writing a person picked up without time and learning. He looked at it longer than he meant to. Something in it stirring that same quiet pull he had felt before, the one he had chosen to ignore. She noticed, not in a way that called him out, but in the way her hand rested briefly over the paper before she moved it aside, as if she understood what he had seen without needing him to say it. "Supper will be ready soon," she said, turning back toward the stove, her sleeves already rolled, her hands returning to work. Caleb nodded, but his eyes drifted once more to where the paper had been, the impression of it still there on the wood like something that had not fully left. Outside, the rain continued, steady and patient, washing over the land in a way that did not rush anything. Inside, something else had begun to take shape, quiet and easy to overlook, but they're all the same, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. The rain did not stop that night. It settled into the roof and the ground and the spaces between, steady and unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. Caleb sat at the table after supper, his hands wrapped loosely around a cup that had long since cooled, his eyes resting on the place where the folded paper had been. She moved about the room in the same quiet way, putting things in order, wiping down the table, setting aside what would be needed for the morning. Nothing in her movements asked for notice, and yet he noticed anyway. It was not just the work. It was the way she did it. Careful, but not hesitant. Certain, but not showy. The kind of certainty that came from knowing more than a person said out loud. He had seen that before. He just had not understood it at the time. The fire settled low in the stove, the light from it soft against the walls, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then she finished what she was doing and sat across from him, not directly facing him, but close enough that the table did not feel like a distance. The rain filled the space again, a steady rhythm that made it easier to leave things unsaid. "You read and write well," Caleb said after a while, the words coming slower than he expected. It was not a question, but it held one anyway. She did not look surprised. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers loosely folded, and gave a small nod. "I had reason to learn." He waited, thinking she might say more, but she did not. The answer stayed where it was, simple and complete in a way that did not invite digging. "Most folks who come out this way do not carry that kind of learning with them," he said. She glanced toward the window, where the rain blurred the land beyond, then back to the table. "Most folks do not carry what they cannot keep," she replied. There was something in that settled deeper than the words themselves, something that reached back to that moment on the platform when she had stood still while others stepped forward. Caleb leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under his weight, his eyes narrowing just a touch as he looked at her again, not the way he had before, but closer now, as if he was trying to see past what was easy. "You ever been out west before this?" he asked. "No," she said, her voice steady. "This is the first place I have stayed." The way she said stayed, not come to, not passed through, caught his attention in a way he did not expect. He let the silence stretch again, longer this time, the kind that made a man either fill it or sit with it. He chose to sit. After a while, she stood, moving to bank the fire for the night, her hands working the coals into a slow, lasting burn. He watched her, the way she knew exactly how much to cover, how much to leave open, how to make something last without smothering it. It was not guesswork. It was knowledge. When she finished, she turned toward him, pausing just a moment like she might say something more, but then she only nodded, a small, almost invisible gesture, and moved toward the back room. Caleb remained where he was, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling, the rain easing just enough to be heard instead of felt. His eyes drifted once more to the table, to the place where that folded paper had rested, and something in him shifted again, not sudden, not sharp, just present in a way that would not leave. He had chosen what made sense. That was what he had told himself. But since he was beginning to understand, did not always see everything that mattered. The rain cleared by morning, leaving the land washed clean in a way that made everything look sharper than it had the day before. The sky stretched wide again, pale blue with thin clouds drifting slow across it, and the air carried that fresh, cool edge that only came after a long night of steady weather. Caleb stepped out early, the ground still damp under his boots, the scent of wet earth rising up with each step. He moved through his usual work without thinking much about it, but his mind did not stay where his hands were. It drifted, quiet and persistent, back to the small things he had started to notice. The way she spoke without saying too much, the way she knew things without being told, the way that folded paper had looked in her hands, like it belonged to a life that had not fully followed her here. By midday, he had reason to ride into town. Supplies that could not wait, a few things the ranch needed that he could not make or mend himself. It was not unusual. What was unusual was the way he thought of bringing her along, then decided against it without fully understanding why. Some habits stayed firm, even when other things began to shift. The town looked the same as it always had. Dust settled back into place, voices low and familiar, people moving through their routines like they had never left them. Caleb tied off his horse near the mercantile and stepped inside, the bell over the door giving a soft ring that carried through the small space. Mr. Hadley stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled, spectacles low on his nose as he looked up with a nod that came from years of knowing the same faces. "Caleb," he said, setting aside the ledger in front of him. "You made your choice at the depot the other day." Caleb gave a small nod, not offering more than that. It seemed enough. Hadley studied him for a moment, then reached for a sack behind the counter. "Heard about that," he went on, his voice even, not prying, just stating what had already been said elsewhere. "Quiet girl, the one you took. Keeps to herself, I hear." Caleb shifted slightly, resting one hand on the counter, the wood worn smooth under his palm. "She does what is needed," he said. That seemed like the right answer. Hadley nodded, but there was a look in his eyes that lingered just a second longer than necessary, like he was measuring something Caleb had not thought to measure himself. "There was another one," he said after a moment, his tone changing just enough to catch attention. "The one at the end of the line. Did you notice her?" Caleb felt something in his chest tighten, not sharp, just enough to make him still. He kept his face the same, his voice steady. "There were a few," he said. Hadley gave a small huff, not quite a laugh. "No, I mean that one. Eliza Hart. Name has been around longer than you might think." Caleb did not move. The name settled into the space between them like something that had weight to it. Hadley leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for something that did not belong to the whole room. "She worked back east before coming out. Not just any kind of work. Educated. Trained. Heard she turned down more than one offer before that train ever reached here." Caleb's hand remained on the counter, but he felt it differently now, like the ground under him had shifted just enough to make him notice. Hadley straightened, setting the sack down in front of him. "Folks like that do not come out here without a reason," he added, "and they do not stay where they are not seen." Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like something he was only now beginning to understand. Outside, the sun hung high over the town, the lights steady and clear, but it felt different than it had that morning. Sharper, less forgiving. He picked up the supplies, nodded once, and stepped back out into the open air, the sound of the door closing behind him softer than it should have been. For a moment, he stood there, the reins in his hand, the town moving around him like it always did. Then, without meaning to, his eyes drifted toward the far end of the street, toward the direction of the depot, toward a place that had already passed but had not fully left him behind. Caleb rode back slower than he had come, though the distance had not changed and the road stretched the same as it always did. The sun sat high for a while, then began its slow drop, and still he did not push the horse any harder than a steady pace. Hadley's words did not leave him. They settled somewhere deeper than he liked, turning over in his mind in a way that made the quiet feel different. Educated. Trained. Not the kind of person who ended up standing at the end of a line unless something had gone wrong or something had been chosen on purpose. Caleb tightened his grip on the reins without realizing it, then loosened it again, the leather warm under his fingers. He replayed the moment at the depot, not the way it had happened at the time, but slower now, piece by piece. The dust, the voices, the line of women, and at the end of it, her. Still, certain, not asking. He had seen it. He knew he had. And he had turned away. The thought did not come sharp. It came steady, the way a truth does when it does not need to prove itself. By the time the ranch came into view, the light had softened into that late afternoon gold that made everything look like it belonged somewhere. The fence line stretched out ahead, the same one she had repaired, holding straight against the wind. He slowed the horse as he approached, his eyes moving over the land, then toward the house. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. She was there. Of course she was. That had not changed. And yet something in him shifted as he saw it. Not relief, not exactly, but something close enough to make him pause before dismounting. Inside, the house held the same quiet order it had begun to take on. The table set, the air carrying the faint smell of something warm on the stove. She stood by the window this time, not working, not moving, just looking out across the land as if she was measuring it in a way he had never thought to. When the door opened, she turned, her expression the same as it had always been, steady, present, not asking for anything. "You were longer than usual," she said. Caleb nodded, setting the supplies down by the table. "Had things to get," he replied. The words felt smaller than they should have. She gave a slight nod, accepting it without question, and turned back toward the stove, lifting the lid of a pot to check what was inside. The small, familiar motions continued, but Caleb did not move to sit right away. He stood there, watching her in a way he had not before, not just seeing what she did, but trying to understand it. The way she held herself. The way she seemed to know what was needed before it was said. The way nothing in her asked to be noticed, and yet everything about her stayed present once it was. "You ever worked a place like this before?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. She glanced at him briefly, then back to the stove. "I have worked where work needed doing," she said. It was not an answer that closed anything. It was one that left room. Caleb stepped closer to the table, resting his hand against it, the wood familiar under his palm. "That kind of work," he said slowly, nodding toward the window, toward the fence, toward everything that had been quietly changed since she arrived. "It is not something most learn on their own." She turned then, meeting his gaze directly, not guarded, not open, just steady. "Most things are not," she replied. Silence followed, not heavy, but full in a way that did not let him look away as easily as before. For a moment, he considered asking more. About where she had come from. About what she had left. About why someone like her had stood at the end of a line and waited to not be chosen. But the questions stayed where they were, unspoken, because something in him understood that answers, when they came, would not come from asking. They would come the way everything else about her had come. Quiet, certain, and already there before he realized he should have been paying attention. The next morning did not feel like the others. Nothing had changed in the way the sun rose or the way the land stretched out under it. But something in Caleb's chest sat different, like a thought that had settled in and refused to move along. He went through the motions the same as always, boots on, coffee taken without much notice, the door opening to the same wide stretch of quiet that had always been enough. But it was not enough now. Not in the same way. The work pulled him out across the property, the fences, the water, the small repairs that never seemed to end, but his mind did not stay with his hands. It kept circling back, not just to what Hadley had said, but to what he himself had seen and chosen to ignore. By midday, the sun pressed down harder, the air dry again after the rain, and Caleb found himself stopping near the far edge of the land, looking out across something he had known for years and seeing it as if it did not quite belong to him the same way anymore. He turned back earlier than usual, not because the work was done, but because something else had begun that he did not know how to finish. When he reached the house, the door stood slightly open, just enough to let the air move through. He stepped inside without calling out, the quiet meeting him in that same steady way, but there was something different again. The table was not set. The stove was not lit. The small signs of her presence, the ones that had built up without him noticing, were not there in the way they had been. For a second, he stood still, his hand resting against the edge of the door, listening. Then he saw it. The folded paper, placed in the center of the table, not tucked away, not hidden, just left where it could be found. He stepped closer, slow without meaning to be, and picked it up. The paper felt worn, like it had been carried for a long time, but the writing was clear, careful, the same hand he had seen before. He read it once, then again, the words settling in deeper each time, not loud, not accusing, just steady in a way that did not need to raise its voice. It spoke of a name that had been used before she came here, of work that had required more than what most would expect, of choices made not out of lack, but out of knowing what was being left behind. It did not explain everything. It did not need to. It told him enough. Eliza Hart had not been waiting to be chosen. She had been waiting to see if anyone would recognize what stood in front of them. Caleb lowered the paper slowly, his hand tightening just slightly around it before he set it back down where it had been. The room felt larger now, not emptier, just wider in a way that made the silence stretch further than it had before. He turned, stepping back outside, his eyes moving across the land as if she might still be there somewhere, as if this was something that could be undone by finding the right direction. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign. Just the same wide stretch of earth and sky and distance that had always been there. He stood on the porch longer than he realized, the sun shifting overhead, the light changing slowly as time moved forward whether a man was ready for it or not. And in that stillness, something settled fully into place, not sudden, not sharp, but undeniable. He had not missed her because she was hidden. He had missed her because he had not looked closely enough when it mattered. Caleb did not wait for the sun to set before he moved. He went back inside once, long enough to take the paper from the table and fold it carefully, not the way it had been before, but in a way that made it feel like something he needed to carry. Then he stepped out again, the decision already made before he could question it. The horse was saddled faster than usual, the leather pulled tight with hands that did not hesitate, and within minutes he was on the road back toward town. The same path he had taken so many times now feeling different under him. The land stretched out the same, mile after mile of open ground and sky, but he did not look at it the way he used to. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on something beyond what he could see, something that had already slipped past him once. The ride took time, more than he wanted, less than he deserved, and the sun began its slow drop before the town came into view again. When he reached the depot, it stood as it always had, quiet between arrivals, the platform empty except for a man sweeping dust that would settle again before the day was done. Caleb dismounted without a word, tying off the reins before stepping up onto the worn boards, his boots echoing slightly in the stillness. He looked down the length of it, the memory of that day rising up without effort. The line, the choices, the moment he had turned away. The man with the broom glanced at him, nodding once before going back to his work, not asking questions that did not belong to him. Caleb stepped further along, his eyes scanning the space like something might still be there, like time might have left a piece behind if he looked closely enough. But there was nothing, just wood worn smooth by years of waiting and leaving. He turned then, heading toward the mercantile, the bell over the door ringing as he stepped inside again. Hadley looked up, surprise flickering briefly before settling into something quieter. "You back sooner than expected," he said. Caleb did not waste words. "Where did she go?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Hadley studied him for a moment, the kind of look that measured more than what was being asked. Then he set his hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly. "You mean Eliza Hart," he said. Caleb nodded once. Hadley exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in the way a man does when something has already moved past the point of easy answers. "She did not stay long after the train left," he said. "Took a room at the boarding house for a night. Left early the next morning." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough to show, but enough to be felt. "Where?" he asked. Hadley shook his head. "Did not say, but there was talk she had business further north. A town near the river. People there have need for someone with her kind of learning." Caleb absorbed that without speaking, the direction settling into place like something he should have known before he ever asked. He turned to leave, then paused, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. Hadley watched him, quiet now, understanding more than he said. "You did not see her that day, did you?" he said finally, not accusing, just stating what had already been proven. Caleb did not answer. He did not need to. Hadley nodded once, slow and certain. "Then you best ride fast," he said. "Folks like her do not stay waiting." Caleb stepped back out into the light, the town moving around him the same as before, but none of it held his attention now. He untied the reins, swung into the saddle, and turned the horse toward the northern road without hesitation. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air carried that quiet stillness that came just before night. He did not slow. Not this time. The land stretched ahead, wide and uncertain, but for the first time since that day at the depot, Caleb did not look for what made sense. He rode toward what he had missed. The road north stretched longer than Caleb remembered, though he had never ridden it with this kind of weight behind him. The sun dropped low and then disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint silver of moonlight and the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth. He did not stop when the light faded. He did not turn back when the land grew unfamiliar. There was something in him now that did not measure distance the way it used to. It measured time, and he had already lost more of it than he cared to admit. By the time the first signs of the river town came into view, the sky had begun to pale again, the edge of morning just starting to push through the night. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin and early, and the sound of water moving somewhere beyond the buildings carried through the still air. Caleb slowed the horse only when he reached the edge of town, his eyes scanning the place not like a visitor, but like a man searching for something he had no guarantee he would find. The buildings stood close together, wood-worn by weather and use, signs creaking lightly as the breeze moved through. A small clinic sat near the center, its door already open, a lantern still burning low inside though the day was beginning to take over. Caleb dismounted without thinking, tying off the reins to the nearest post before stepping toward it. Inside, the space smelled faintly of herbs and clean linen, the kind of place built for steady hands and quiet work. A man stood near the back, sleeves rolled, sorting through a small stack of papers, and he looked up as Caleb entered, his expression shifting from routine to curiosity in a single glance. "You are early," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "We do not usually see folks this time of morning unless it cannot wait." Caleb stepped forward, his hat still in his hand, his eyes moving once across the room before settling back. "I am looking for someone," he said. The man studied him for a moment, not rushing the silence, then nodded slightly. "Most people who come through that door are," he replied. Caleb took a breath, the words sitting heavier than they should have. "Eliza Hart," he said. The name settled into the room in a way that changed the air, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. The man's expression did not shift much, but something in his posture did, a small adjustment that suggested recognition without giving it away fully. He set the papers down, wiping his hands on a cloth before stepping closer. "And what would you be to her?" he asked. Caleb did not answer right away. The question was simple, but the truth behind it was not. He looked down briefly, then back up, his voice quieter than it had been before. "Someone who should have seen her sooner," he said. The man held his gaze a moment longer, weighing something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then he gave a slight nod toward the back room. "She is working," he said. "Has been since before sunrise." Caleb did not move immediately. For a second, he stood there, the distance between where he was and where she stood feeling larger than any stretch of land he had crossed to get there. Then he stepped forward, slow but certain, the sound of his boots softer now against the wooden floor. The door to the back room stood partially open, just enough to let the morning light slip through and catch on the edges of what lay beyond. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his breath steady but deeper than usual. Inside, she stood with her back to him, sleeves rolled, hands moving with that same quiet certainty he had seen from the beginning, but now there was no doubt left in it. This was not something she had learned along the way. This was something she had always carried. Caleb did not speak right away. He simply stood there, watching, understanding now what had been in front of him all along, and feeling the full weight of the moment he had let pass without seeing it for what it was. For a moment, nothing moved between them. The morning light slipped through the window, catching in the dust and the quiet, settling across the room like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for this moment to find its place. Eliza's hand slowed, then stopped, not in surprise, but in recognition of something she had already felt before she turned. When she did, it was not sudden. It was steady, the same way everything about her had always been. Her eyes met his, and there was no question in them, no confusion, only a calm understanding that made the distance between them feel smaller and larger all at once. Caleb did not step forward right away. He stood where he was, his hand still resting lightly against the doorframe, his breath measured, as if he needed to learn how to speak again without rushing past what mattered. "I should have seen you," he said finally, his voice low, not heavy, not pleading, just honest in a way that did not try to fix what had already happened. Eliza held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted, not toward him, but inward, like she was measuring the weight of what had been said. "You did see me," she replied after a moment. "You just chose something else." There was no edge to it, no accusation, just truth, placed gently where it could not be moved aside. Caleb nodded once, the motion small but certain. "That is true," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It held everything that had led them there, every moment that had been missed, every small sign that had been overlooked. He stepped forward then, not quickly, not to close the distance all at once, but enough to show he was no longer standing apart from it. "I came because I understood too late what was in front of me," he said. "I do not expect that to change anything." Eliza watched him, her hands resting at her sides now, no longer working, but not idle either. They were still the same hands. Steady, certain, the kind that built things without asking if they would last. "Some things do not change because we understand them," she said quietly. "They change because we choose differently when it matters." Caleb let that settle, not arguing it, not trying to reach past it. He looked around the room then, taking in the place she had made for herself, the quiet order, the work already in motion, the life that did not wait for anyone to arrive before it continued. "You belong here," he said. It was not a question. Eliza followed his glance, then returned her eyes to him. "For now," she answered. It was enough. Caleb took a slow breath, the kind that did not rush the moment, and nodded again. "Then I will not ask you to leave it," he said. The words came easier now, not because they were simple, but because they were true. He reached into his pocket then, pulling out the folded paper he had carried with him, the edges worn, the shape familiar. He placed it gently on the table between them, not handing it back, not holding on to it, just setting it where it belonged. "I did not understand this when I first saw it," he said. "I do now." Eliza looked at the paper, then at him, and for the first time, something in her expression softened, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something that held both what had been and what could not be undone. Caleb stepped back then, not turning away immediately, but giving the space the respect it had earned. "If you ever find yourself needing a place where someone sees you as you are," he said, his voice steady, "I will have one." He did not wait for an answer. Some things were not meant to be answered in the moment they were spoken. He turned then, moving toward the door, the morning light shifting as he stepped through it, carrying him back into the open air. Behind him, the room remained as it was, steady, certain, holding what had been built without him. Ahead, the road stretched out again, wide and quiet, but no longer empty in the way it had been before. This time, he knew what he was leaving, and that knowing, quiet and unyielding, would stay with him longer than anything he had ever chosen too quickly to understand.